Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. You know, this past week in the UK, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, suggested that welfare benefits were in some way responsible for turning a man into a mass murdering child killer who killed 6 of his children by arson. This episode of the Keiser Report, we ask the same. Has quantitative easing and decades of sponging off the taxpayer turned banks into bloated Yobbish addicts? And has our indulging them with immunity from justice for fraudulent mis-selling of derivatives and interest rate rigging turned bankers into serial wealth confiscators unable to pass a single dime on the street without wanting to steal it? And mass murdering arsonists burning down financial markets around the world. Why? 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 Just because. Just because. Hey, Stacy Herbert, what's happening? What's happening? What's happening, Stacy Herbert?
Apparently that's what happens when you become a welfare bum. You just want to burn down things.
Yeah, that's right. In the city of London, you get a few nickels in your pocket or a few pounds, and you become an arsonist. Like this guy, I think it's a good point. He's accused of burning down his house and killing his kids. The same thing as the leaders of HBOS or the HSBC, Barclays, Lloyds, Royal Bank of Scotland. They're arsonists, they're murderers, they can't stop, you know, they're sick. They're on the tit of the government, or they say here the teat, and it's all bad from there.
Well, George Osborne of this guy, Mick Philpott, he said that he asked whether the taxpayers should be subsidizing these sort of lifestyles, which of course then you look at the headline from the exact same week. HBOS ex-CEO Crosby sitting on £25 million pension pot. Former HBOS chief executive James Crosby is entitled to a £700,000 annual pension from his time at the company. It would cost £25 million to buy a pension of that size. A UK parliamentary commission on Friday criticized Crosby and 2 other former HBOS executives for sowing destruction at the mortgage lender and called for them to be banned from working in the financial sector. Right.
Well, there's no deterrence for committing arson in the financial sector. This guy, Philpott, he's going to be, of course, brought before a court and facing justice in some way for killing people. But for Crosby, there's no justice, because here in the UK and around the world, if you steal money using bank fraud and securities fraud, like Crosby does, or like the leaders of Barclays, HSBC, Lloyds, and Royal Bank of Scotland commit securities fraud every single day of every single week, there's no deterrent. There's no societal pressure not to commit massive fraud. There's no penalty. There's no reason not to. Moral hazard, you know, this idea that, well, if you let a bank commit fraud, they'll just continue to commit fraud, that's out the window. We now have serialized, sanctioned banker financial hooliganism that is resulting in people like Philpott. Philpott should get a job running HSBC. Don't put him in jail. Put Philpott, the guy who killed his kids and burned them to death, he should be running Barclays. He should be running Bank of England, not Mark Carney. Mark Carney is just a smooth-talking money printer. Put Philpott. He knows how to burn people alive. Put him as Bank of England, you freaking morons. George Osborne.
So here we have a man responsible for an awful crime of killing his children. So let's see how their friends and family and people around them justify their behavior.
I don't understand why he doesn't get a £700,000 a year bonus and a pension plan, Philpott. He proved himself to be an arsonist and a murderer. George Osborne, this is your man to run Bank of England. This is your man to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Philpott.
So Philpott's lawyer says, man behind Derby fire, a very good father. A man who killed his 6 children in a house fire was a very good father who never meant to harm them, his lawyer said. So with this argument that he was a good father and he just, accidentally killed his 6 children, I want to turn to how people use that excuse for bankers in the banking sector and central banks. And we look around us and we see a financial system in utter collapse and bringing quite a lot of grief to people around the world. And see how this excuse is applied to bankers everywhere. So a tweet from CNBC's John Carney says, there was a big Twitter fight between Stacy Herbert and Isa Kaminska, but I have no idea what it was about. Well, I'm going to tell you what it was about, but first I want to...
Yeah, baby, Twitter war. My girls win. I'm going to punch them out, yeah.
So I want to tell you how first Isabella Kaminska responded to this tweet by John Carney. And she said, correction, I wasn't arguing, was being bombarded by accusations based on misrepresented interpretation of my piece.
She got that in a tweet?
Yeah.
That sounds like a long tweet.
So we're going to look at what her own words were that I responded to. And the title of her article by Isabella Kaminska in the Financial Times, you could look this up yourself, was When Memory Becomes Money, the story of Bitcoin so far. Now, she starts off her piece saying that it's worth mentioning that Bitcoin was first popularized in the murky underground universe of Silk Road. So it's just these illegal drug dealers and takers and users and abusers who are the ones that popularized Bitcoin. And then she says it's also those like gold bugs, those weird gold bugs and speculators who have an interest in inflexible markets, that they don't want flexibility of a fiat currency. And then she says, that said, it's understandable why the darker elements in society might feel threatened by an economic system that's trending towards a more equitable distribution of wealth by means of government-controlled fiat system. The threat is heightened further when governments are doing their best to counter the hoarding wealth in concentrated pockets by means of dilution through processes such as quantitative easing. So she's saying that quantitative easing is lessening income inequality and wealth inequality.
Right, and you picked a Twitter war with her, and you pummeled her because, for a few obvious points, that she is misstating. One being that quantitative easing has done something other than increase this incredible disparity in the society between the have-yachts and the have-nots. The concentration of wealth, because of quantitative easing, has become overwhelmingly concentrated at the very tippity-tip of the very tippity-top. Now, the Financial Times, of course, faces an existential threat from Bitcoin, as does this woman's career as a journalist, as do all journalists who don't accept Bitcoin as the cyber Christ, who is here to save the economy and people from the misreporting of Financial Times and The Economist magazine and Bloomberg and CNBC, who are all aligned with the devil. The Bitcoin emergence will put an end to that. It's now $2 billion in market cap. We mentioned $1 million Bitcoin a few weeks ago. It's great to be a Bitcoin millionaire. Well, now it's great to be a Bitcoin millionaire times 4.
I did send her a tweet. I didn't engage in a fight. I was just curious to know, does she really genuinely believe that the purpose of quantitative easing, that it was the best efforts of the central banks to, as she say, that they were doing their best to counter the hoarding of wealth? Were they really, really interested in that? She responded with these 3 tweets. QE is about wanting to dilute and distribute, take from savers who are profiting in deflation disproportionately, and lessen the burden on debtors who are proportionally having more pain. The problem is the banks get in the way of the mechanics. Banks are blocking the process.
Quantitative easing is forced deflation on savers, you could say it in that manner. In other words, in the United Kingdom, 220 billion pounds of savings, of capital, has been forced from savers to the City of London to be used for purposes of speculation. So in Cyprus, they just took people's bank accounts. At MF Global, they just took people's bank accounts. Here in the UK, they've already stolen 220 billion pounds of people's wealth to give it to the City of Wall Street to speculate. That's a forced deflation. It's not reacting to deflation. This is the primary objection I have with this lunatic crackpot's tweet, is that she believes that the central bank is somehow reacting to deflation. No! No! The central bank is causing deflation in the capital accounts of those who are supplying this economy, which is supposed to be free market capitalism, with capital. You can't have capitalism without capital. So why is the central bank stealing the capital from people who have it that could supply what's needed to grow the economy? Why? Because they're like Phil Pot. They're Phil Pot. They're arsonists, they're lunatics. Just go back to the beginning of my show, play it again, drop some acid, play it a 3rd time, smoke a joint, play it a 4th time. You must embrace what's happening here. Bitcoin has risen.
Well, again, she had said that fiat is more flexible, so better stability, a better store value, and fairer allocation all around. And that these banks, it was the banks who were responsible for blocking the process of redistributing all of this quantitative easing.
Let's disabuse this knucklehead of what the role of the banks are in this equation. Quantitative easing means that the Bank of England is telegraphing that they're going to be buying billions of pounds worth of gilts in the market. Banks simply front run those purchases. They just get in front of those purchases. They do it through a repo market so that they are in fact not putting up any capital at all. They're borrowing capital at 10 basis points to capture a 1.5% to 2.5% interest on those bonds. They are being rewarded to borrow as much money as possible at that rate that's almost zero, that's being created by zero interest rates or zero interest rate policies. Again, she's absolutely wrong. Why the FT fire this woman? Because she's making it look like a jackass, okay? She doesn't know anything about anything.
But she says that it's helping the debtors, and this is very important because they're being unfairly penalized. So let's look at the biggest debtor in the world, who is the U.S. government. And I saw a tweet from Convert Bond, Lawrence McDonald. He's a former junk bond trader from Lehman Brothers. Remember the bank that famously collapsed September 15th, 2008, took down the whole global system with it. He writes, U.S. government interest costs on debt are $360 billion, lowest since 2006. Despite total debt moving from $8.5 trillion to $16.8 trillion in that period. So quantitative easing, first of all, the banks aren't blocking the process. They're lending it to the government. They're just not lending it to Joe Bag of Donuts out there on the street. They're lending to the government. Is it any more secure? Is this helping anything by our governments being twice as in debt now as they were at the beginning of this process?
Well, she's saying that we need to help the debtors. That debting, if you're debting above and beyond the capacity of the economy and you're a debt-aholic, then the worst thing that can be done is to give the debtor more debt to exercise their demon of debt-aholicism. You want to actually take the debtors off the debt methadone, and you want to reward savers. The way to turn this British economy around would be to jack interest rates up to 5% immediately. Get rid of all the dead wood. Yeah, the housing market would go through a transition, but you'd get rid of all the dead wood, the bad actors. You'd make room for entrepreneurialism. You'd make room for growth. But Osborne and Carney are just going to keep rewarding the methadone clinic of debt-aholism, and the austerity measures are going to continue, and there's going to be more arson, more dead kids, more blood on Osborne's hands. Thanks, Osborne, for killing those kids with your ridiculous policies. All right, Stacy, we got to go. But listen, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
All right, stay tuned for the second half. I'll be speaking with Reggie Middleton about dodgy dealings at Irish banks. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Reggie Middleton of BoomBustBlog.com. Reggie, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back.
All right, Reggie, you're out with an explosive new report talking about the financial ground zero, as you call it, the fraud at the highest levels of AIB in Ireland. Talk about it.
Well, I was always skeptical of the Irish banks. Their problems are very similar to the problems we have in other EU and US banks, where basically they gave a lot of loans, didn't underwrite them very carefully or accurately against overpriced or overvalued collateral. That collateral reduced in value, okay, but the loan stayed. And basically, when you have assets that drop, and debt that remains the same, it's equity that's eaten away. And that's the problem with these banks as well as the other banks. Okay, now
Reggie, let me jump in and ask you this. In other words, if I'm understanding you correctly, the Irish banking system, we were told, was bailed out. 100% of the bond holders were made whole. The state took on 100% of all the liability. The Troika points to Ireland as the poster child of everything that can go right with their prescriptions. Are you telling me that the Irish banking system is about to get another huge bailout and collapse?
Well, I have no idea if they're going to get a bailout, but you know, the collapse looks like it's going to happen. If it doesn't happen, you know, it looks like there may be some prestidigitation, you know, some Harry Potter style magic, but the problem is there. Okay, now I went over the initial problem, and of course they were bailed out once. Possibly again, and then they had a troika injection because the government possibly didn't have enough money to bail out another time. But after going through the papers and going through the records that were filed, and both with regulatory bodies in Ireland, in America with the SEC, and the actual paperwork charges that were given to the offices in Ireland, you see a lot of discrepancies. One very big discrepancy was the actual charge. A charge is very similar to a mortgage in the U.S., where they give an asset in exchange for financing, and they pledge the collateral to the person that they got the loan from, or the entity that they got the loan from. The actual paper that was filed with the Irish office says that each and every security, eligible security, is covered under this charge. Now, in their annual report, it states that certain securities were covered under the charge. Now, it's a very minor difference from a nomenclature perspective, but from a meaning perspective, it's an awful lot. Now, it appears that a lot of lay people are having a problem understanding the difference. So I'm going to give a very visual understanding. Here, we have American notes, right? It's a bunch of money. Okay. Now, you have a person who says they have a claim on certain of these notes. And then you have another person who says I have a claim on each and every one of these notes. Now, which one of these would be the more valuable claim? Certain of these notes or each and every?
Right, absolutely.
And this is basically the issue with AIB. And the AIB is saying to the public that there's a claim on certain, but the actual document that they filed said there's a claim on each of the notes.
Right, so as we've seen throughout this
Now,
entire...
put that way, hopefully it's easy to understand.
As we've seen throughout this entire crisis, you always come back to a question of the value of the collateral. The collateral that people are using to buttress all of these refinancing schemes and bailout schemes itself is not worth the paper that it's not printed on. So here you have AIB about to crash again. Now, the Irish taxpayer owns AIB. So is the Irish population about to get Cyprus? In other words, is there going to be a bail-in now in Ireland where they're going to ask depositors to contribute? They're just going to take money from depositors. This is a new trend. We saw it with MF Global. We saw it in Cyprus. Are we going to see it now in Ireland, Reggie?
That depends on if the Troika is willing, the Troika and Germany et al. Are truly willing to foot the bill for the full bailout. You call it a bail-in, but it's basically a bailout. To discuss what happened in Cyprus and what very well may happen in Ireland, you have several levels of capital structure in a bank. You have depositors on the bottom, and most depositors don't think of themselves as investors. They think of themselves as someone who avail themselves of a bank's services for a very, very low risk storage of their capital. Okay? And then you have higher on the hierarchy, you have junior and senior bondholders, okay, who assume risk voluntarily in exchange for a materially higher return than the depositors. And then above them, you have the equity stakeholders who assume even more risk for presumably a higher return. Okay, now, I believe you should wipe out all investors who assume risk, if a bank goes bust, because that's basically what you are getting in return for, the risk of it going bust or the potential for it doing well. Depositors are a slightly different story. Now, you do assume risk when you put your money in the bank, okay, but you assume a very low modicum of risk, okay? If you wipe out depositors, you basically destroy the banking system because the banks basically are made up of depositors. That is the largest funding base, that is the most liquid funding base, and it should be the scarcest funding base. But for some reason, I think a lot of the mindset in Ireland is we have no choice but to put our money in banks. If there's even the slightest chance of you losing any principal at all, okay, is it worth 0.07% return on your money, or 1%, or 1.2%, or 3%? Ask the people in Cyprus who are getting 4, 4.5, 5 to 6% if it was worth losing 60% of their capital.
Right. I mean, in Ireland, it is an interesting situation because, of course, the banks are backstopped now by the Troika, which includes the IMF, the ECB, and the EU. And what you're saying and what now people understand is that, for example, the IMF is in self-bankrupt. The EU is bankrupt. The ECB, European Central Bank, is insolvent. It's bankrupt. So people need to understand that these banks that they're putting their money in are backed by banks that are in turn bankrupt. The Bank of International Settlements, which collateralizes all these central banks, is insolvent. So that's something people need to wrap their minds around. Of course, the governments and the state-owned media outlets like RTE in Ireland have failed to carry that message and tell the truth to the population, so they're culpable in an act of financial terrorism. That's without doubt. But the people in Ireland feel as though it's their moral obligation to help bail out these banks. Is that true?
Well, we'll find out, because I don't believe, especially if Cyprus is a template, I don't believe that the ECB and the IMF are going to bail out the banks. I believe that the guys with their checking and savings accounts are going to bail out the banks, if Cyprus is a template. And I truly do believe that it's either Cyprus is a template, or you're going to have a lot of political ramifications when Germany is asked to foot a bill, as well as the rest of the EC, the EU, the IMF, etc. This can't go on for long. I have a whole list of banks. You know, I listed Anglo-Irish, I listed Allied Irish, but I have a whole list of banks to reveal. And each and every one of them have played significant games or bust from a purely fundamental perspective. And, you know, the way I see it, and I could be wrong, of course. You know, I have been wrong in 1999 once, so it is possible. But the way I see it, each and every one of these are going to need a bailout if you look at them from a fundamental perspective.
Okay, so just to recap, your call is that Irish banks that have already crashed and needed a bailout are in a position now, as we've said on this show now for several years, and as I told people in Ireland myself personally, these banks are going to crash again and require yet another huge response, which could be like Cyprus, where they just take the money directly out of your account. Now, I wanted to ask you about the connection between the Troika. As part of the bailout, they didn't want to avoid a credit event that would trigger the credit default swap mechanism from coming into play. So how much pressure did the U.S. and the American bankers apply to the IMF to hide the fact, when they went through the initial crash, that this was all about preserving wealth on Wall Street and had absolutely nothing to do with the people in Ireland?
If I was a fly on the wall, I would assume that fly would have heard that the U.S. was basically calling the shots. You know, if you take a look at the association that determines credit events, okay, that association is made up of, or that panel is made up of, some of the biggest CDS writers, you know, in the world. So that's like going to a fox and asking him his opinion of whether chicken should be served for dinner.
Okay, fair enough. Let me ask you, let me expand on that a little bit. What kind of blowback are we going to see in the U.S., if any, and what banks might be involved?
That's interesting, because if you can prove misrepresentation, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm definitely not a lawyer at all, so don't take it as legal advice, but as a layperson, as common sense perspective, if you could prove misrepresentation, do CDS get paid off, or is this a different venue? In addition, several banks are proven to be significantly undercapitalized or materially over encumbered. Okay, what happens then? Even if CDS are written off, there's not enough capital in the system, not enough equity in the system to pay it off. You know, if I'm not mistaken, when I was on your show before, my opinion of the CDS is we have 5 people in a room, okay? One of them had some money, and everybody else was borrowing money from them in a circle, okay? And they were insuring this person. They're insuring their partners. I insure B, B insures C, C insures D, D insures E, and then E comes back and insures me. If one of us take a significant loss, you just have dominoes fall.
Right.
Okay, and it's just not enough capital, not enough money to pay for it.
If this was a porno film, that scene would be called the daisy chain.
Yes, it would.
Let me move on to post-Cyprus. What about Spain, Italy, France? What are the signs that the savings in these countries are about to be stolen by the Troika and these other clowns?
I will get to them, you know, through the site, and it's actually a lot of work, it's a lot of time. There's that many banks that are in trouble. But I can tell you this much. The money, if you consider it to be stolen, will probably be stolen by those who ran the banks into the ground and then expect to be recapitalized versus driven out of business. Okay, now, there is a sense where you could say it's justified that those who put their money in the banks will lose their money if they put their money in the bad bank. But then you have to re-examine the entire system and what a bank is. Okay, is the common depositor, is the common grandmother who puts their money into a certificate deposit or demand deposit or savings account, is she expected to be a credit analyst? Problem is, interest rates are too low. Okay, you put your money into a bank, you're getting, in the U.S., you're getting 0.7% return, maybe 1% return. Okay, if there's any risk there, rates have to be much higher. There's no way in the world to avoid higher rates when people realize that there's significant risk in their banks. Even a small modicum of risk, rates have to go up. There are just not enough fools to go around to give a risky investment to somebody, or to take a risky investment, to give somebody a risky investment and give them a return of 0.7%. It's just not enough fools to go around. It may be a lot, but not enough to support a global banking system of the size that it is now.
All right, Reggie Middleton, we're out of time. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
You're very welcome. It's good to be back. It's good to be on a truly independent show.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Reggie Middleton of the Boom Bust blog. If you'd like to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttvru. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all. Court and facing justice in some way for killing people. But for Crosby, there's no justice, because here in the UK and around the world, if you steal money using bank fraud and securities fraud, like Crosby does, or like the leaders of Barclays, HSBC, Lloyds, and Royal Bank of Scotland commit securities fraud every single day of every single week, there's no deterrent. There's no societal pressure not to commit massive fraud. There's no penalty. There's no reason not to. Moral hazard, you know, this idea that, well, if you let a bank commit fraud, they'll just continue to commit fraud, that's out the window. We now have the same thing as the leaders of HBOS or the HSBC, Barclays, Lloyds, Royal Bank of Scotland. They're arsonists, they're murderers, they can't stop, you know, they're sick. They're on the tit of the government, or they say here the teat, and it's all bad from there.
Well, George Osborne of this guy, Mick Philpott, he said that he asked whether the taxpayers should be subsidizing these sort of lifestyles, which of course then you look at the headline from the exact same week. HBOS ex-CEO Crosby sitting on £25 million pension pot. Former HBOS chief executive James Crosby is entitled to a £700,000 annual pension from his time at the company. It would cost £25 million to buy a pension of that size. A UK parliamentary commission on Friday criticized Crosby and two other former HBOS executives for sowing destruction at the mortgage lender and called for them to be banned from working in the financial sector.
Right, well, there's no deterrence for committing arson in the financial sector. This guy, Philpott, he's going to be, of course, you know, brought before into serial wealth confiscators, unable to pass a single dime on the street without wanting to steal it. And mass murdering arsonists burning down financial markets around the world. Why? 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 Just because. Just because. Hey, Stacy Herbert, what's happening? What's happening? What's happening, Stacy Herbert?
Apparently that's what happens when you become a welfare bum. You just want to burn down things.
Yeah, that's right. In the city of London, you get a few nickels in your pocket or a few pounds, and you become an arsonist. Like this guy, I think it's a good point. He's accused of burning down his house and killing his kids. Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. You know, this past week in the UK, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, suggested that welfare benefits were in some way responsible for turning a man into a mass murdering child killer who killed 6 of his children by arson. This episode of the Keiser Report, we ask the same. Has quantitative easing and decades of sponging off the taxpayer turned banks into bloated, yobbish addicts? And has our indulging them with immunity from justice for fraudulent mis-selling of derivatives and interest rate rigging turned bank